So for those of you who don't know, I'm a chemical engineer, also known as a process engineer. My background, well, I started with EPC companies, and I started up for myself basically as soon as I possibly could. I am not a natural employee, yeah, I went freelance about 4 years after I graduated, and mostly worked in design. I've done a fair amount of commissioning, and as I got older and more experienced, I spend more and more time marking other people's homework rather than doing the work myself. I still like to do a bit of all of these things where I get the chance, but yeah, mostly nowadays I'm looking at where other people have got it wrong, which is informative. And one of the things that I'm often asked to look at, one way or another, is how good is this work? How good is this work? How good were the engineers and other designers involved? Were these people, well, I'll stick to using the word good for now. Were they good enough? So I wasn't as focused on this at the start of my career as I am nowadays, but there's always a chance of being judged working as a designer, and that can extend over quite a long period of time. So I've been an expert witness in court, where somebody was being asked to account for design decisions they'd made 20 years earlier. Luckily, this was a person who kept good records, so he was able to point to the point in his notebooks where he had told somebody a certain thing and go, no, that person, what that person is saying, one, doesn't accord with my memory, and two, doesn't accord with the note that I wrote at the time. So he actually, the court found in his favour, and he didn't end up having to I think there were millions of pounds involved, and he was going to be personally liable for it. So one, it can cost you money under certain circumstances. In the UK, certainly, it can involve jail time. Fines are possible. Being struck off by your engineering registration body, if indeed you have one. Here in the UK, we don't really. I know that some of you are in the States and other jurisdictions where there is such a thing as professional registration for engineers, but here there isn't. But all the same, you can do without being thrown out of your professional body publicly. You can lose your reputation, and therefore you can lose work. And it's, for those of us who care about the quality of our work, being found to have done bad work is not something I'd enjoy. It wouldn't give me job satisfaction to think that I'd done a poor job. So there's good, and there's good enough, which we'll cover in some detail before we're done. But why not be better than how other people want us to be, how other people require us to be? So the law requires us to be competent and to follow the law. Why not just stick to that? Why be better than the law requires? Why be better than our professional engineering institution requires? And this comes down to values, personal values. So we all have our own ideas of what's good and bad, and I'll talk about this later, but people do better than just good enough because they believe that it's important. So why not be perfect? Engineering is not for perfectionists. Engineering is messy compromises. Maybe not always messy, but certainly compromises. So we are balancing cost, robustness, and safety. And yes, if you talk to some people who work in safety, everything should be 100% safe 100% of the time. Well, it can't be. Stay at home in bed because you're scared to go out. Well, you'll die in bed. There's no way out of it. There's no completely safe outcome. So you have to be safe enough. You have to be good enough as far as safety is concerned. You have to be good enough as far as the environment's concerned. That's what's required of us. Because safety costs money. and environmental protection costs money, and engineering is a way to make money. It's a business at the end of the day. There is no non-commercial engineering. There are no engineering projects, as far as I'm aware, other than those that are intended to make money. So in engineering, perfectionism is a mental health issue rather than a virtue. There are, as I've illustrated here, a number of self-help books for anybody who has this mental health issue, and I recommend they go and buy one and perhaps find another career where you can be perfect. Perhaps academia, where we can all be perfect because there are no consequences. So there are lots of different kinds of good, and sometimes this can be a difficulty in talking about this sort of area, because when people think that you're judging them morally. Sometimes people have a tendency to think that you're judging them morally, when actually you're judging how good they are at whatever it is they're trying to do. So I'm sure that people can be great people whilst not being particularly good engineers. But I'm going to look at 5 kinds of good. So there's are you legal? And that can certainly be tricky in the real world. Are you competent? Now, because I work as an expert witness, I see quite a lot of incompetence. Mostly not caring, mostly being under too much pressure to carry out due diligence, but also a certain amount of green graduates, especially, not knowing what they don't know. And I did that at the start of my career too. But a lot of people have quality control systems, quality management systems. So there are boxes to tick. Then there is the issue of personal values. So is your work as good as you are? Do you agree with what you're doing morally? So there is a moral stroke ethical sort of goodness. And then there's, are you as good as they say you must be, where they are professional engineering institutions. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn. So these are imposed, other than one of them, they're imposed on you from outside by police, managers, professional registration bodies. So I use the term here, communities of practice. So this is unfortunately a bit of humanities research, but the communities of practice, an idea. So these are informal communities. So they're not the institution of chemical engineers or whatever. They are. It's the people who do what you do. It's the people who do the thing you want. So you start out on the outskirts of this, and perhaps you get mentored by the next layer in, and then over time you get closer and closer to the center of things. You get closer and closer to the people who are, I guess, most highly thought of by the people who do what you do. And these people are not necessarily, in fact nowadays are rarely, the same people who head up the professional engineering institutions, who tend to come from quite often not so. For example, I used to be a member of the Institution of Chemical Engineers. In fact, I was on the ruling body of that for a little while. We didn't see eye to eye, but the other people who were on that ruling body were unheard of by other engineers, because most of them were sort of middle management in big oil and gas companies, or they were academics. They were not particularly much to do with the everyday business of chemical engineering. So communities of practice matter, because communities of practice, they have a way of seeing things. Quite often, their way of seeing things would differ from that of the professional engineering institutions. And then there's personal conscience. So Personal conscience is not external. And actually, I'm going to argue that personal conscience is the thing that differentiates excellent engineers from mediocre ones. Because all of these systems, these imposed systems, tend to push back against excellence. They perhaps think that they're encouraging excellence, but actually they tend to oppose excellence, and instead they tend to encourage compliance with stated minimum standards, and therefore have a secondary unintended effect of pressing everybody to mediocrity, to being just good enough. If you want to be better than just good enough, that quite often comes with penalties. Now, all these systems interact with each other. So quality management systems affect various other systems. Professional engineering institutions have a different set of crossovers, and your personal values and the values of your community of practice can interact with each other and with all of these other things. So this was the reason why I split this into 5 things. It's a slightly artificial distinction because all of these things actually cross over. But all the same, you're looking at a number of quite fundamentally different kinds of goodness, not all of which are actually to do with being a good designer. So this little graphic that I'm using here is actually itself mixing a couple. So this tends to be the one that you're looking at in court. So are you negligent or grossly negligent, or did you even intend to design something such that it would kill 20,000 people? Because that's frowned upon. But above that, above negligent is good enough. And I'm going to argue that's what most people are shooting for. Above that are things like good engineering practice, let's say, which would be better, and best practice, which would be better still. Best practice usually tends to mean you win awards, things of that nature. You're recognized as being an outlier. And going up these takes effort. So actually, human nature being what it is, and the nature of these systems being what they are, most people shoot for good enough, because being negligent is actually false economy. You're going to get hassled. All of these systems are going to give you problems if you're negligent. So anybody, just through enlightened self-interest, will tend to avoid being negligent. But if you go from good enough to better, you're making additional effort, which is probably not going to be rewarded. And also, you're going to start to run into difficulties, often difficulties to do with people, as you're pushing. Quite often, you have to push the rest of the system around you. It's difficult to achieve best practice without the rest of the system around you changing. And the rest of the system isn't shooting for best practice. The rest of the systems are shooting for good enough. So they're not actually going to celebrate your attempt to shoot for best practice. On the contrary, you're quite often going to get some negative reactions. But let's start with the basics. Let's start with staying out of jail. Yeah, let's stay out of jail. Let's not get court rulings against us. Let's not get fined $1 million. Yeah. So, generally speaking, the legislation that applies is national. If it's really serious, it could be a criminal case, but mostly not. Mostly you're dealing with a civil case. Here where I tend to work, there's absolute liability, and there's I guess in Canada they go absolute liability, strict liability, and if it isn't an absolute or strict liability situation, you're allowed a due diligence defense. I think in Canada, if it's strict liability rather than absolute liability, you're allowed a due diligence defense. Just to unpack that, if there's an absolute standard of proof, then essentially all they have to do is prove that you did it. You can't defend yourself against it. You did it, you're guilty. That's the end of it. In the UK, if it isn't absolute, you get to mount a due diligence defence. In Canada, they have this middle of the road thing where there's strict liability, where you're definitely guilty, but you definitely get a due diligence defence. What I mean by this is, if you have followed all of the codes, if you are legal and you're compliant with all the codes and you have done everything that could reasonably be expected of you, the fact that you're absolutely guilty of having done something which resulted in the outcome, because it wasn't foreseeable, because you followed all the codes and standards, it's a lot less culpable than if that wasn't the case. There's also different standards of proof in criminal and civil cases. So in a criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt, pretty much everywhere around the world, or some form of words like that. In a civil case, it's the balance of probabilities. So if it's 51% likely that you screwed up, well, then you screwed up. So it's quite a low standard of proof, and very large sums of money can hang on this. Around the world, there are essentially two approaches. So in the UK, it's pretty much all professional judgment. So you exercise professional judgment. You've read the codes, you've read the standards, you know them. But if it's your professional judgment that you don't think that that particular code or standard applies in this particular case, or you wish to interpret it, well, you're not wrong. But the opposite applies. If you have followed exactly what it says in the codes and standards, but the plant still exploded, well, that's your fault. Because so some countries codify everything. The French love to codify everything. All of their law is coded in exquisite detail. And things are very prescriptive. Either you complied with the law or you didn't. Whereas in the UK, everything's a bit more flexible, and we don't have those kinds of codes. And then around the world, approaches mix and match these two. So there'd always be an element of, did you follow the codes and standards? And there'd be an element of, did you have professional judgment? And from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the relative proportions of those two things will differ. So that's being legally compliant. And I guess the number one problem I have with this is law breaking is widespread in engineering, in my experience. Let's not concern ourselves with the small scale stuff that happens when people are away on business. Bribery and corruption is endemic in engineering. That's the truth of the matter. There's international legislation that says that it absolutely shouldn't happen ever. And anybody who's ever been involved in international engineering work knows that there are many countries in the world in which contracts will not be won unless somebody somehow is bribed. And a far smaller number of people get prosecuted for this ever than should be. So I was first introduced to this very early in my career. I had a job out in Turkey, and I was taken over by experienced engineers, and there were these really helpful guys, and some of these really helpful guys worked for the client, and people who worked for the client were taking us into their offices and showing us all these files, and I'm thinking, these guys are really helpful. And this was because we were with a guy who went to school with them. He was a really helpful guy too. And anyway, I figured out what was happening after a while. Anyway, we didn't win. But anyway, I found out afterwards that we didn't win because the French guys we were up against had an even more helpful guy. Unfortunately, that helpful guy had a wife who wanted to leave her husband, and he gave her half of the money he was bribed with to go away and keep quiet. And she did go away, but she didn't keep quiet, and she reported her husband to the authorities, and it all came out. But I have seen a lot of it since, and as far as I can see, the only thing that changed when they brought in new international legislation was that the helpful guy was no longer called an agent, he was called a sponsor, and his fee was no longer 10%, it was 5%. But other than that, from various conversations that I have had with engineers, there are a lot of perhaps managers rather than engineers who are not legal. And being as I tend to just work as an engineer, I think it likely that there's a lot of other questionable activity that goes on above my pay grade. But so not all engineers are even legal, and only a small percentage of those cases ever go to court. I don't see a lot of that in my professional practice. What I see a lot of is this: are you competent? And I think the first thing to note about competent for anybody here who's relatively recently graduated is that there is an expectation in the courts that engineers are competent from the day they start practicing. So you don't get special dispensation if you graduated 6 months ago. If you do something incompetent 20 years later, you can be held to account for it. Your mentors, supervisors, managers, etc., are supposed to protect you. They're supposed to check your work and make sure that you don't do anything incompetent, because let's face it, if you graduated 6 months ago, you are going to do things that are incompetent, because what the universities turn out nowadays is not people ready to work as competent engineers from day one. So that tends to be the problem. A lot of the time, people who aren't competent don't know that they're not competent. When I was newly graduated, maybe 6 months or a year after graduation, I used to work as a proposals engineer. So I'd design a plant and I'd price it and I'd write a tender document and I'd send it in. And at first I always used to lose, and then I got really excited. It was this job I was going to win, and I just got beaten at the last moment. But luckily I lost. I say luckily I lost because afterwards I reviewed, what I'd done to see, why I didn't win. And I'd left out the motor control centers and the MCCs and the PLCs and basically all of the switchgear and the controllers, and it was a lot of money. If we'd won, the company would have probably gone bust. But I didn't know. I didn't know you needed those things really, so I left them out. I never did that again. I moved up a notch in competence on the basis of that experience. But most new engineers make mistakes of that magnitude early in their career, and if they're lucky, as I was, they don't ever have to deliver on promises they mistakenly make. So I guess those are the people who don't know, and then there are the people who don't care. Some businesses, competitive tendering, the people who win, they've just put a price on the table that will win. There's no margin in there for error. They've priced things rather optimistically. They can't afford to care. They just needed to win, just to keep the wheels on. And and I see a fair amount of that because the business I mostly work in is municipal water, and it is a very, very low margin business. And a lot of civil engineering companies have moved into it, and they bid things at or around the price of the materials, working on the assumption they're going to be able to make profit when it comes to variation orders for the things that they left out but sort of kept quiet about in the tender documentation. So, and then they argue it all out in court. And again, this makes lots of work for expert witnesses, this makes lots of work for engineers, but it doesn't make for a quality engineering job. So there was a time when I worked as an internal assessor for ISO 9000, which was BS 5750 at the point where I did this. And this cartoon is quite correct, that such systems do not say that you have to be good or competent or excellent. They don't say that you produce a high quality product. They say that you produce a product of a consistent quality. Consistently bad, perfectly acceptable. And of course, the problem with it quite often is it's easy for this to turn into a tick box exercise, what they call technical compliance. So we've ticked all the boxes, therefore all good. Quality has been achieved. And then there's wholeheartedness. Did we really do a quality job? And sometimes that means doing a quality job would involve leaving some of the boxes unticked. But I did a fairly recent job in the nuclear industry where they had just enormous quantities of quality control documentation. And all the boxes were ticked, and these were fabulously detailed matrices of hundreds of boxes. And what ended up happening is that it just became obvious that this was in Excel. People just cutting and pasting hundreds of answers in blocks because there wasn't time to answer all of these questions. There wasn't even time to think about them. There was only time to fill in the form. And this mattered because actually I looked at the quality of the work that had been done, and the quality of the completion of the forms seemed pretty good, but the quality of the work was terrible. The quality of the work was student work. It was very poor quality work. It was full of mistakes, obvious mistakes, which had apparently been checked by 3 layers of more senior engineers. But it was bad. And when I pointed this out, the more senior engineers at the top said, yeah, we knew it was bad, but we knew you were coming. You'd point it out and then we'd fix it. Well, that's not how the system's supposed to work. If you think it's bad, you're supposed to say it's bad, go in and fix it, come back. But they just decided to kick it down the road instead. Then there's the question of your own personal, moral, ethical framework. So the problem with this kind of good is that people's idea of good differ quite radically. The whole of society is having issues with this at the moment. Everybody wants what's good. We can all agree on that. We all want what's good. We all want what's fair. It's just we can't agree on what's good and what's fair. And your personal ideas of what's good and fair may differ from those in your community of practice. They may differ from those of your professional engineering institution. And this may be a problem for you. You may end up having to put your money where your mouth is. You may end up, if you don't want to work in nuclear, you may end up saying, I don't want that job. I don't work in nuclear. I'm too good for that. Yeah. I'm too good for nuclear. I'm too good for oil and gas. I'm too good for big pharma. I'm too good for alcohol manufacture. Yeah. I'm too good for all of these things. Well, by the time you finish being good, there may be nowhere left for you to work. A lot of the products that are produced by the chemical industry, there are people who are opposed to them. There are people who are opposed to plastic and to petrol, and so on. So, I mean, I work in water. I genuinely thought that would be the most ethical thing to work in back when, I was less cynical and old than I am now. And even that's contentious because now people don't just want water that's fit to drink. They want water which is free of every contaminant at every concentration. And they're constantly coming up with new, what they call contaminants of concern. And the thing is, these things are present, but modern analytical techniques can detect such vanishingly small concentrations of things. So yes, they're present, but are they present at a level that anybody has shown caused harm to humans? No, they're not. Very few of these things are present at a level of genuine concern, unless you don't understand that the dose makes the poison. So even water engineers ended up as the bad guys, So there's no way around it. Whatever you do, some people are going to think that you should be doing something better, as they define better. So I guess the thing that really matters from the point of view of the individual practitioner is your work as good as you are? Are you doing something that you think is worthwhile? Because I guess whatever you think is worthwhile, if you don't think that what you're doing is worthwhile, it's hard to imagine it being very satisfactory. It's hard to imagine a lot of job satisfaction doing something which you genuinely thought was doing harm in the world. So there's a potential clash here with the other definitions. And then there are the professional institutions. So they very often have things to say about how good you need to be. Some of them are actually to do, to my mind, with being a good engineer. And if people are going to be given a ticket to say that they're allowed to call themselves engineer, well, then I guess these things should be on the list. But because of the nature of bureaucratic institutions, some other things find their way on there that are nothing to do, to my mind, with being a good engineer. They're to do with being a good person, in inverted commas, but sometimes it's somebody else's idea of what a good person is. And it's sort of imposing on people an alternative view of what is good and what is bad. And I personally don't think that that's appropriate. I think that the job of a professional engineering body should be to say that somebody can design a good plant. And I guess a good engineer could design a good plant to make, something positively beneficial, or they could design a plant to make something positively harmful. And if in doing that, they were exercising their engineering skill with equal judgment, that would be compatible with being a good engineer. It wouldn't be compatible with being a good person, but I think those are two different things. So safety first. I mean, a lot of the rest of it, well, most of the rest of it is to do with things that are imposed on you anyway. But documentation and record keeping is important. And it's important from a personal point of view. That guy who ended up in court 20 years after an everyday decision, which he made 100 of every day, who had his notebook, the reason why probably his testimony in court was believed is because he had the notebook with his physical note dated, showing that that's what he recorded as having decided on that particular day. And communication and collaboration, again, yeah, I think that's important from a personal point of view. But then there's other stuff. There's a lot of other stuff about, again, the imposition of a certain idea of what constitutes good, point of view of a section of society. And it doesn't even matter whether you agree with that particular view of what is good. I personally would object to it, whichever side of the debate they were on. You can't require that every single person who practices a profession shares your essentially political views. That is not a proper rule for a professional engineering institution to set up. Requiring the people operate as competent legal engineers, yeah, requiring that they operate within their competence and don't do things that they're not competent to do, requiring that the things that they do, that they're carefully thinking about the safety and implications of their decisions. Yes, that's all quite proper. But requiring people to subscribe to your view of the world, I don't think that's good. I don't think that's right. So this particular part of it came from a guy who's dead now. It's really helped me, when I was learning to teach. So this is what he called the J curve. And this is making the same points I made earlier about negligence. That we've got this graph here. The bottom point represents negligence. So quality of practice along the bottom, effort required up the side. Hopefully you can see that. Never mind what the units of these things are. The reason why he's got a wiggly line on the side there is because it might take a great deal of effort even to be barely competent, you know. But anyway, whatever the size of the left-hand side of the graph, what this graph is showing is the same point I made earlier, that most people are going to stay at the minimum point on the graph because the quality of practice lower than the low point on the graph, that minimum effort point, it actually requires more effort to be worse than the bottom point on the graph. So that bottom point on the graph is compliance. So all of these different external people are trying to get you to achieve minimum quality, a minimum quality. If you do less than that, it actually takes more effort. Doing more than that also takes more effort, but doing more of that up to a certain point, that extra effort produces additional quality. Eventually, as you can see, the curve of the graph, you reach a point of diminishing returns. Getting better and better and better takes more and more and more effort. But the early part of the graph, you know, doing a little bit better than bare compliance isn't that hard. But if you really want to be excellent, it takes a great deal of effort, and the system is probably going to oppose you. So I already talked about what community of practice was. Human nature means that most people hit minimum effort. And minimum effort is bare compliance, and bare compliance is, tends to correlate strongly with competence. So being competent tends to be set somewhere around that minimum. The way it's often defined in law, in fact, is the performance that could reasonably be expected of a qualified person, the average qualified person practicing that profession. So by definition, competence is mediocrity. If mediocrity is not very good at all, that doesn't matter as far as the courts are concerned. They just want you to be average. Yeah, they don't want you to be brilliant. Competence is being average. If the average person who does that job is rubbish, being rubbish will do. But normally, it's because we're in a practical business, what's required is being okay. So most people that you come across tend to be okay most of the time, even in expert witness cases, where I am asked to say if somebody is competent, I'm quite often reluctantly go, well, yeah, they're kind of all right. I could criticize their decisions, but we'd always criticize in hindsight. This was an everyday decision that somebody made. I've just spent 4 weeks poring over it in exquisite detail with the benefit of knowing what happened as a result of it. Of course, I'm going to say I could have done better. But would the average engineer on the average day have done any better than this guy? Nah. He was average. He was mediocre. Yeah, he was competent. And most people, it's relatively rare for me to go, no, this person was absolutely incompetent. I just forget any idea of in hindsight or whatever. He should have known. Yeah, that was a bad decision. Yeah, and it should have been obvious to him. And furthermore, it should have been obvious to the guy who checked his work, and he didn't do anything about it. It should have been obvious to the guy who checked that guy that, this company have acted incompetently. Their entire process has failed. That not just one individual, but the entire process has failed here. A bad decision's been made, and it got built, and it failed in some way, which led to this expensive or sometimes fatal consequence. But that's relatively rare, which I guess is always going to be the case when what you're looking for is mediocrity. If you're looking for mediocrity, you're going to find a lot of it by its nature. Well, the general rule is this externally imposed goodness tends to drive things towards mediocrity. It also adds the same amount, at least, of admin overhead to everyone. So people who could actually do with more time to be excellent spend time filling in forms that they don't need to fill in. They were always going to tick all those boxes in their head. And then some other boxes, the person who made up the form never even thought of. Any improvement over targets tends to be opposed. So in the end, if you're going to do anything other than be average, it's a question of who you consider to be your community of practice, who you look up to, want to be like, consider to be your group of practitioners. What are its values, whether they're stated formally or otherwise, and what price you're willing to pay. Are you willing to walk away from a job or argue with management or whatever it is that's required to stick to what you think is good enough? Because excellence and mediocrity lie in two different directions entirely. So this is my summary of that. I think I've just got one more slide. So I was talking to Catherine at the start. I've written 4 books, one of which is likely to be of interest to you, which is the layout book. I gave a talk to you last year and said I was about to update this. Without going into too much detail, negotiations with Elsevier have dragged on somewhat, but I am still going to update this. I am negotiating to have the rights back from Elsevier, and that means that the next edition will be not just bigger and better, but also cheaper, since I'll be publishing it myself and not aiming to sell it to university libraries as Elsevier do. So that is the end of the presentation. I don't know if you have any questions.
I guess an obvious question would be, has technology, has technology overall increased the competence?
No, I think if anything, the opposite. So I'm 62. I learned to draw on a drawing board with a pencil, I started with slide rules. So I'm from an era where people had mental arithmetic and they had a certain spatial awareness. Everybody was taught metalwork and woodwork and things of that nature, and could use tools. And what I see now is, so when calculators came in, they were an improvement. There's no two ways about it, but something was lost. And the something that was lost was that slide rules required you to have an idea of the order of magnitude of the answer, which didn't matter at first. For the average person, that wasn't a disadvantage at all. So by the time I was teaching, which is 15 years ago now, it was already the case that my students had no idea how many of the numbers on their calculator meant anything. They would quote me the answer to however many figures there were on the display of their calculator. They had no feel for order of magnitude. They had no feel for what was spurious precision. And it's not just an academic criticism. It's that they didn't know that to an engineer, pi is usually 3.1, 3.14. All the rest of it's for physicists or something, mathematicians. Engineering, we're mostly working to 3 significant figures. And all the rest of it that's better than we actually know about. That's better than our input data. Yeah, so it's not worth concerning ourselves with that. So that's been lost, and that was already lost 15 years ago. And then the other thing that I used to find when I was teaching 15 years ago, and of course the people I was teaching 15 years ago are now moderately experienced engineers, is that they would give me the results of modeling program output, which they thought constituted a robust design solution to the problem that had been set. And the problem with a lot of modeling software, simulation software, PySys, those sorts of things, they're an excellent tool in the hands of a skilled professional used for the thing that they're supposed to be used for with due diligence. The problem is in the hands of somebody who doesn't understand things and doesn't sense check things and doesn't understand that the program doesn't understand, they produce very nice looking output, which is garbage. So they didn't seem to understand that, and it was difficult to explain that to them. And now we have the situation in which people are using LLMs like ChatGPT for this sort of thing. And I'm having a correspondence on social media about all of this. Already there are too many people who haven't even read the cautionary statements which the manufacturers of these products send out with the product, saying, no, this is not answering your question. It isn't going to substitute for you. At best, this is throwing some ideas out there. You absolutely shouldn't take them for granted. It's still your job to exercise judgment. So that's the thing that I think people are ceding to technology. They're ceding their judgment to technology. They're ceding their responsibility to technology. They're thinking, ChatGPT says it's so, it must be so. HISIS says it's so, it must be so. My calculator says it's so, it must be so. It doesn't matter what the tool is. It's always the engineer, the designer's responsibility to own whatever they put out. And I think even though the people who manufacture all of this technology tell you you mustn't do this, I think we're back to that rule of human nature, the rule that minimum effort. So what should I do? Should I use ChatGPT, which takes me 15 seconds, and then spend 3 days checking its output? Or shall I, as my manager quite possibly wants me to, shall I just use ChatGPT and do a whole lot of other things in those 3 days? And there seems to be an awful lot of that. Chemical engineering doesn't seem to be too bad for it at the moment. They've given up in software writing, as far as I can see. I mean, people who write software are expected to use LLMs to write the software. They are not expected and not given time to do the due diligence, which you're required to do. I expect that this is going to be quite lucrative in the next few years as these design decisions made on this basis come through the system, turn into court cases. They're going to require expert witnesses to go to figure out forensically what happened. And I'm expecting to see a lot of that people go, ChatGPT said it was true.
Yeah, and when the proverbial stuff hits the fan, your excuse can't be that ChatGPT said it was okay.
No.
And because they will not accept any responsibility.
Well, did you see the post I did the other day where I asked ChatGPT why ChatGPT would never replace engineers?
Oh, yeah, I read that. Which is good.
So ChatGPT will tell you this if you ask it to.
There's some good stuff in the chat. Anyway, thanks for the presentation, Sean. That was very interesting.
Right. Thanks for inviting me. And I will let you know when I've finally sorted out the paperwork with Elsevier, when I'm going to be producing the new book, because I know there's certainly some of your members are going to be able to give me some useful input with the layout book.
Thank you so much, Sean, Paul, and everyone for attending. Yes.
All right. Thank you all. See you next time.